Dirty beards. As you know, an ordinary unhairy face like yours or mine simply gets a bit smudgy if it's not washed often enough, and there's nothing so awful about that. But a hairy face is a very different matter. Things cling to hair, especially food. Things like gravy go right in amongst all the hairs and stay there. You and I can wipe our smooth faces with a flannel and we can quickly look more or less all right again. But a hairy man can't do that. We can also, if we are careful, eat our meals without spreading food all over our faces. But not so with a hairy man. Watch carefully next time when you see a hairy man eating his lunch, and you'll notice that even if he opens his mouth very wide, it is impossible for him to get a spoonful of beef stew or ice cream and chocolate sauce into it without leaving some of it on his hairs. Mr. Twit didn't even bother to open his mouth wide when he ate. As a result, and because he never washed, there were always hundreds of bits of old breakfasts and lunches and suppers sticking to the hairs round his face. They weren't big bits, mind, because he used to wipe those off with the back of his hand or on his sleeve while he was eating. But if you looked closely, not that you'd ever want to, you would see tiny little specks of dried up scrambled egg stuck to the hairs, and spinach and tomato ketchup, and fish fingers and minced chicken livers, and all those other disgusting things that Mr. Twit liked to eat. Look, there's a picture, can you see? If you looked closer still, and hold your noses, ladies and gentlemen, if you peered deep into the moustachy bristles sticking out over his upper lip, you would probably see much larger objects that had escaped the wipe of his hand. Things that had been there for months and months, like a piece of maggoty green cheese, or a mouldy old cornflake, or even the slimy tail of a tinned sardine. Because of all this, Mr. Twit never went really hungry. By sticking out his tongue and curling it sideways to explore the hairy jungle around his mouth, he was always able to find a tasty morsel here and there to nibble on. What I'm trying to tell you is that Mr. Twit was a foul and smelly old man. He was also an extremely horrid old man, as you will find out in a moment. Mrs. Twit. Now, Mrs. Twit was no better than her husband. She did not, of course, have a hairy face. It was a pity she didn't, because then, at any rate, it would have hidden some of her fearful ugliness. Take a look at her. Have you ever seen a woman with an uglier face than that? I doubt it. But the funny thing is, Mrs. Twit wasn't born ugly. She had quite a nice face when she was young. The ugliness had grown upon her year by year as she'd got older. Why would that happen? I'll tell you why. If a person has ugly thoughts, it begins to show on the face. And when that person has ugly thoughts every day, every week, every year, the face gets uglier and uglier until it gets so ugly that you can hardly bear to look at it. A person who has good thoughts cannot ever be ugly. You can have a wonky nose and a crooked mouth and a double chin and sticky out teeth, but if you have good thoughts, they will shine out of your face like sunbeams and you will always look lovely. Nothing shone out of Mrs. Twit's face. In her right hand, she carried a walking stick. She used to tell people that this was because she had warts growing out of the sole of her left foot and walking was painful. But the real reason is so she could hit things with it, like cats and dogs and small children. And then there was the glass eye. Mrs. Twit had a glass eye that was always looking the other way. The glass eye. You can play lots of tricks with the glass eye because you can take it out and pop it back in again anytime you like. You can bet your life Mrs. Twit knew all the tricks. One morning she took out her glass eye and dropped it into Mr. Twit's mug of beer, when he wasn't looking. Mr. Twits sat there drinking the beer slowly. The froth made a white ring round the hairs around his mouth. He wiped the white froth onto his sleeve and wiped his sleeve onto his trousers. "You're plotting something," Mrs. Twits said, keeping her back turned so he wouldn't see that she'd taken out her glass eye. "Whenever you go all quiet, I know that you're plotting something." Mrs. Twit was right. Mr. Twit was plotting away like mad. He was trying to think up a really nasty trick he could play on his wife that day. "You'd better be careful," Mrs. Twit said, "because when I see you starting to plot, I watch you like a wombat." "Oh, do shut up, you old hag," Mr. Twit said. He went on drinking his beer, and his evil mind kept working away on the latest horrid trick he was going to play on the old woman. Suddenly, as Mr. Twit tipped the last drop of beer down his throat, he caught sight of Mrs. Twit's awful glass eyes staring up at him from the bottom of the mug. It made him jump. "I told you I've been watching you," Mrs. Twit cackled. "I've got eyes everywhere, so you'd better be careful."